A devoted service dog collapses in the middle of a bustling hospital, leaving doctors scrambling to save him. But when they take a closer look, what they uncover will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Dr. Ethan Walker had spent his entire morning in back-to-back appointments, the routine chaos of the animal hospital keeping his mind occupied. It was just another day. Cats with upset stomachs, dogs needing vaccinations, an anxious parrot that wouldn't stop repeating, "Hold still," the usual. But none of it mattered the moment he heard a loud thud behind him. The entire clinic fell silent. Ethan turned so fast his chair nearly toppled over. There, sprawled across the white linoleum floor, was Ranger, his 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, his service dog, his lifeline. "Ranger!" Ethan's voice cracked, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against Ranger's ribcage, feeling for the rise and fall of his chest. There it was, a heartbeat, faint but steady. "Dr. Walker, what happened?" Amy, one of the vet techs, rushed over, gloves still on from her last patient. "I don't know," Ethan stammered, his hands shaking as he brushed the dog's tanned fur. "He was fine a second ago." Ranger's breathing was labored, his body motionless. Ethan's stomach twisted as he stared into the dog's half-lidded eyes. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a simple fainting spell. Something was wrong. "Get the crash cart!" Ethan barked, shifting into professional mode, despite the fear clawing at his throat. Amy bolted toward the supply room while Dr. Patel, Ethan's colleague, stepped in. Could be heat stroke, low blood sugar, seizure. Patel ran through the possibilities as they lifted Ranger onto the nearest exam table. Ethan shook his head. No, he wasn't overheated. He ate this morning. He was fine. But fine dogs didn't just collapse. The monitor beeped as Amy hooked Ranger up, his pulse slower than normal. Ethan rubbed his forehead, his mind racing. Ranger had been with him for years. Through war zones, through the sleepless nights of PTSD, through surgeries, he had always been the strong one. "Let's get an X-ray," Ethan finally said. He had no logical reason for it, but his gut told him something deeper was at play. Amy nodded and wheeled the machine over. As they carefully positioned Ranger, Ethan's fingers brushed against a scar near the dog's hind leg, an old, barely noticeable wound from years ago. He had never thought much about it before. The machine whirred and Ethan exhaled, staring at the screen as the image began to load. His heart pounded in his chest. Then the room went dead silent. Because right there, lodged near Ranger's spine, was something Ethan had never expected to see. Ethan's breath hitched. The X-ray flickered on the monitor, its ghostly black-and-white image casting an eerie glow across the room. There, lodged dangerously close to Ranger's spine, was a small, dark object. Perfectly round, metallic. A bullet. Silence gripped the room. "No way," Dr. Patel muttered, leaning in closer. "That can't be right." But it was. Ethan felt his pulse pounding in his ears as he studied the X-ray. The bullet had been inside Ranger for years. The scar near his hind leg. He had always assumed it was from a minor injury during their deployments. He had been wrong. "How is this possible?" Amy's voice was barely above a whisper. Wouldn't you have noticed? Wouldn't it have caused him pain?" Ethan swallowed hard. He had been with Ranger every step of the way. He had treated his wounds, bandaged his paws, watched him recover from every scrape and bruise. But he had never once thought to check for something like this. Dr. Patel exhaled sharply. "It's close to the spine, but not touching it. No major nerve damage. That's why he never showed signs of pain. His body adapted." Ethan clenched his fists. His dog, his best friend, had been carrying a bullet in his body for years, and he had never known. But why now? Why had Ranger suddenly collapsed? "We need a full workup," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Blood tests, neurological scans, everything. I need to know what's happening." Amy nodded and got to work. The rest of the team moved with precision, running IV fluids, checking vitals, preparing for further imaging. But Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the screen. The bullet looked old. If Ranger had been shot, it had to have happened before their time at the clinic, back when they were still in active duty. Ethan's mind flashed back to the desert, to the deafening echoes of gunfire, to the countless times Ranger had saved his life. Was this one of those moments? Had Ranger taken a bullet for him? A chill ran down his spine. "Dr. Walker," Amy called softly. "His vitals are stabilizing." Ethan turned, relief washing over him as he saw Ranger's breathing slow to a steady rhythm, but the questions swirled in his mind, relentless. He had thought he knew everything about Ranger, but clearly his dog had been carrying a secret, a silent, buried truth from a past neither of them could fully remember. Ethan sat by Ranger's side, his fingers absent-mindedly stroking the dog's thick fur as the beeping of the monitors filled the quiet room. The X-ray image still burned in his mind. A bullet, buried deep inside his dog, close enough to be dangerous, but somehow forgotten by time. "How did I miss this?" Ethan muttered to himself. Dr. Patel, standing beside him, crossed his arms. "Because you never thought to look. None of us would have." Ethan clenched his jaw. "I should have." His mind was racing back, trying to pinpoint the moment it could have happened. He and Ranger had been through everything together. Countless deployments, missions that had pushed them to their limits, nights when they'd slept in trenches under a sky thick with smoke. But a bullet should have been something Ethan remembered. Ranger let out a soft exhale, his body rising and falling steadily now. His vitals had stabilized, but the collapse still lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. The bullet had been there for years without issue, so why had his dog suddenly gone down? Amy walked in carrying a clipboard, her expression unreadable. "The blood work's back." Ethan braced himself. She hesitated. "It's not good." Ethan's stomach twisted. "There's inflammation around the bullet site," she continued, lowering her voice as if saying it softer would make it less severe. "We think it's causing an immune response. His body is finally rejecting it." Ethan swallowed hard. "After all these years?" "It happens," Dr. Patel interjected. "Sometimes the body encapsulates foreign objects, but if something shifts, even slightly, it can trigger a reaction." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "That's why he collapsed. The bullet had been stable for years, but something, maybe age, maybe movement, had changed that." "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. Amy shifted her weight. "Surgery is an option, but it's risky. The bullet is so close to the spine. One wrong move and—" She didn't have to finish the sentence. Ethan looked down at Ranger, his heart aching. He had made it this far. He had survived war, survived everything. But now, Ethan had never felt more helpless. Ethan stared at the X-ray again, his eyes tracing the bullet lodged dangerously close to Ranger's spine. His service dog had carried this hidden wound for years, never showing pain, never slowing down. And now, after everything they had survived together, this was what could take him down? It didn't feel real. "Surgery is our best shot," Dr. Patel said, his voice even but firm, "but it's not without risks." Ethan barely heard him. His mind was already spiraling through the possibilities. He had seen too many surgeries go wrong. Too many men who had gone in expecting a routine procedure, only to wake up with more damage than they started with. Or worse, not wake up at all. And this wasn't just any patient. This was Ranger. Ethan ran a hand over his face, his fingers pressing into his temples. "What happens if we don't remove it?" Dr. Patel exhaled. "Then we treat the inflammation with meds, but it's a temporary solution. If his body is rejecting the bullet now, it'll keep fighting it. We don't know how long we'd be buying him. Weeks, months, maybe a year if we're lucky." Amy shifted uneasily. "And if the swelling increases, it could press against his spinal cord." Paralysis. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were backed into a corner. Either he risked Ranger's life in surgery or he let the bullet win. Slowly, painfully, and without mercy. Ranger let out a soft sigh, his eyes half-lidded but watching Ethan, as if he knew what was happening. as if he could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on his handler. Ethan reached out, running his hand over Ranger's fur. "You're the toughest damn dog I've ever met," he murmured, his throat tightening. He had seen Ranger take down insurgents, had watched him sniff out explosives before they could claim lives. Ranger had saved him more times than Ethan could count. And now Ethan had to decide whether to put him under the knife. "I don't like either option," Ethan admitted, looking up at Patel. "You're telling me to either gamble with his life or sit back and do nothing?" Patel nodded. "It's not fair, but it's the reality." Ethan clenched his fists. Fair or not, he had to make a call. Because Regenerator didn't deserve to suffer. And Ethan wouldn't let him. Ethan sat on the floor beside Ranger's bed, his back pressed against the cold wall of the veterinary hospital. The decision hung in the air, suffocating him. Surgery meant risk. No surgery meant certain decline. He had made life-or-meth calls before. In war, you didn't have time to second-guess. You acted. You survived. But this was different. Ranger wasn't just another soldier in the field. He wasn't a patient in Ethan's clinic. He was family. Amy crouched beside him, her voice softer than before. "Ethan, you don't have to decide alone." But that was the thing, he did. This was his burden and his alone. Ranger had saved his life more times than he could count, and now the tables had turned. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his palms together. "When we were in the field, there was this one mission." His voice wavered. He hadn't told this story before, not to anyone. Amy didn't interrupt. She just listened. "We were clearing a village. Intel said there were hostiles nearby, but nothing prepared us for the ambush." Ethan swallowed. "We walked into a trap. Bullets started flying, and I—" He hesitated, eyes flickering to Ranger. The Ranger, half-conscious, blinked back at him, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of his voice. Ethan ran a hand over his dog's fur. "I didn't see the sniper, but he did. I turned just in time to see Ranger lunge in front of me." Amy's breath hitched. "He took the shot for you." Ethan nodded. His throat felt raw. Ranger had saved his life that day, and now Ethan had to decide whether to risk his life in return. Dr. Patel walked back in, his expression unreadable. "Ethan, we need to know your call." Ethan sucked in a breath. There was no easy answer, but as he looked down at Ranger, his partner, his protector, his best friend, he knew what he had to do. He reached for Ranger's paw, squeezing gently. "You're a fighter," he whispered, "and I'm not giving up on you now." Turning to Patel, his voice was firm. "Prep for surgery." The room was silent for a beat. Then Patel nodded. "We'll do everything we can." Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, because now all he could do was wait. Ethan stood outside the operating room, his arms crossed so tightly over his chest that his muscles ached. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nose, but all he could focus on was the faint beeping of machines beyond the doors. Ranger was in there, under anesthesia, under the knife, his fate now in the hands of Dr. Patel and the surgical team. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent years trusting his own hands to save lives, to make quick decisions in the field, but now all he could do was wait. Amy sat beside him, her fingers idly tapping against the clipboard on her lap. "You okay?" Ethan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Not even close." Amy sighed. "I get it. But Ranger's strong." "Yeah," Ethan muttered, staring at the closed doors. "Stronger than me." The silence between them stretched. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Ethan's mind drifted back to the first time he had met Ranger. It wasn't in a hospital, or even during training. It was on the front lines. Ranger had been a young, restless military working dog, full of energy but sharp as hell. He had saved lives even then, sniffing out IEDs before they could rip through his unit, chasing down insurgents when human soldiers couldn't. And now, Ranger was fighting a battle inside his own body. Ethan clenched his fists, pushing back the memory of Ranger's collapse. He should have seen the signs. He should have known something was wrong. A sharp sound broke through his thoughts, the OR door swinging open. Dr. Patel stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. How is he? Patel's expression was careful, unreadable. He's stable, but it wasn't easy. Ethan swallowed hard. Did you get it? Patel nodded. We removed the bullet. It was embedded deeper than we thought, but it hadn't punctured any major nerves. Ethan exhaled, his knees nearly buckling from the relief. But, Patel continued, holding up a finger, there was significant inflammation. We need to monitor him closely for the next 48 hours. There's a risk of complications, swelling, infection. Ethan nodded, his mind already preparing for the worst. Amy touched his arm gently. He's made it this far, Ethan. He's got a shot. Ethan let out a shaky breath. Yeah, he does. But as he followed Patel into the recovery room, the sight of Ranger still unconscious, hooked up to tubes and monitors, made one thing painfully clear. The fight wasn't over yet. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the small recovery room. Each beep was a reassurance, a reminder that Ranger was still here, still fighting. But Ethan couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his chest. His dog lay motionless on the padded bed, an IV taped to his front leg. His breathing slow and shallow beneath the oxygen mask. Ethan pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. The sight of Ranger like this, vulnerable, unmoving, was a kind of pain he hadn't prepared for. He had seen his dog charge through bullets, sniff out explosives, take down enemies without hesitation. Now he barely twitched. "Come on, buddy," Ethan murmured, resting a hand on Ranger's back. "You've been through worse." Dr. Patel stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed as he checked the monitors. "Vitals are stable for now," he said, his voice calm but measured. "But the next 24 hours will tell us a lot. We'll have to watch for fever, swelling, anything that suggests infection or complications." Ethan barely nodded. He wasn't thinking about the medical side of things. He was thinking about Ranger. Would he wake up the same? Would he wake up at all? Amy walked in, a cup of coffee in hand, and placed it in front of Ethan. "Figured you could use this." He blinked, realizing for the first time just how exhausted he was. She pulled up another chair and sat beside him. "He's strong, Ethan. Stronger than any dog I've ever seen." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, that's what scares me. He's always been the strong one." He looked down at Ranger, his fingers gripping the fur on his neck gently. What if I made the wrong call?" Amy frowned. "Ethan?" "I mean it," he interrupted, his voice tight. "What if he never wakes up? What if the surgery just put him through more pain for nothing?" Amy hesitated, then spoke softly. "If you hadn't done the surgery, he would have suffered. You gave him a chance, Ethan. That's all we can ever do for the ones we love." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. A few seconds later, Ranger's ear twitched. Ethan froze. "Did you see that?" Amy sat up straighter. "Yeah, I did." Ranger's breathing deepened slightly, his nose twitching. His paws flexed just a little, like he was dreaming. Then his eyelids fluttered. Ethan leaned forward, his pulse pounding. "Come on, Ranger. Come back to me." A few agonizing seconds passed. Then, with a slow, heavy effort, Ranger's eyes cracked open. Amy let out a small gasp. "Oh my God, he's waking up!" Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. He just reached for Ranger's paw, holding it tight as his best friend finally came back to him. Ranger's eyes were open, but they were unfocused, groggy. His breathing remained slow, controlled, but there was something different now. Something alive. Ethan held his breath, watching every flicker of movement as Ranger adjusted to consciousness. "Hey, buddy," Ethan whispered, leaning in close. His voice was thick, rough, barely above a whisper. "You're back." The dog blinked sluggishly, his pupils trying to adjust to the fluorescent lighting above. A faint twitch in his hind leg made Ethan's heart seize. Was it pain, or was he trying to move? Amy checked the monitors, her face alight with relief. Vitals are holding steady. He's still groggy from the anesthesia, but this is a good sign. Ethan exhaled shakily, running a gentle hand along Ranger's head. "I thought I lost you, bud." Ranger let out a soft, slow exhale through his nose, a sound Ethan knew too well. It wasn't distress, wasn't fear. It was recognition, a silent reassurance between partners. The weight pressing down on Ethan's chest finally loosened, if only slightly. Dr. Patel walked in, glancing at the scene before him. "Well, would you look at that," he said, setting down a clipboard. "You weren't kidding about this dog's willpower, Ethan." Ethan huffed out something close to a laugh, shaking his head. "He doesn't know how to quit." Patel's expression softened. "He'll need time to recover. The inflammation should go down now that the bullet's out, but he's not out of the woods yet. We'll be watching for any signs of infection over the next few days." Ethan barely nodded. He wasn't thinking about days. He was thinking about the next few minutes, watching Ranger breathe, watching the life return to his body. Ranger let out a weak whine, his head barely shifting toward Ethan's touch. Amy's voice turned gentle. "He knows you're here." Ethan swallowed hard, his grip tightening ever so slightly around Ranger's paw. "He's never been anywhere without me," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not since the day we were paired together." Amy gave him a knowing look. "And you're still here now." A memory surged forward, unbidden. The desert heat, the deafening pop of gunfire, the moment Ethan had turned to see Ranger lunge in front of him, a split-second decision that had saved his life. Ethan took a shaky breath. "You saved me once, buddy," he murmured. "Guess it was my turn." Ranger's tail gave the weakest wag, barely more than a twitch, but it was enough. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe it. Ranger was going to be okay. Ethan didn't leave Ranger's side. For the next several hours, he remained in the small recovery room, watching every rise and fall of Ranger's chest, every slow blink, every twitch of his tail. The surgical site was still raw, the stitches running along his dog's side a brutal reminder of just how close Ethan had come to losing him. But Ranger was still here. Dr. Patel and Amy checked in regularly, swapping out IV fluids, checking vitals, keeping a close eye on any signs of infection. So far, so good. But Ethan knew better than to relax. The war wasn't won yet. At one point, Amy returned with a small blanket and handed it to Ethan. "You should try to rest," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet." Amy sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, she pulled up a chair next to him, sitting in silence. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need words, the kind that only people who had been through something big could share. After a while, Ranger shifted slightly. His ears twitched, his breathing hitched, and for a moment Ethan thought something was wrong. But then Ranger's eyes opened fully, locking onto Ethan's. The connection was instant. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Hey, bud." Ranger's tail thumped once, weak but intentional. A slow, exhausted wag. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. He felt something inside of him crack, something he had been holding together since this nightmare had started. He placed his hand on Ranger's head, stroking softly. "You scared the hell out of me." Ranger blinked sluggishly but didn't look away. Amy let out a quiet laugh. "I think he's saying the same to you." Ethan huffed, shaking his head. He could still hear the gunfire from all those years ago, still see the moment Ranger had thrown himself into the path of that bullet. And now, all these years later, Ethan had finally returned the favor. Dr. Patel walked in, checking Ranger's vitals. "Looking good," he said, nodding approvingly. "He's a tough one." Ethan smirked. "Yeah. Always has been." Ranger let out a low, content sigh. For the first time since this ordeal started, Ethan allowed himself to believe it. The worst was over. And now, together, they'd walk the road to recovery, just like they always had. A week later, Ethan carried Ranger through the front door of their home. The vet hospital had insisted he stay under supervision for at least a few more days, but Ethan knew his dog better than anyone. Ranger was tired of the sterile walls, the constant beeping of machines, and the gentle but unfamiliar hands of strangers tending to him. He needed to be home. Carefully, Ethan set him down on the large orthopedic dog bed in the living room. Ranger let out a low grunt, shifting to get comfortable, his bandaged side moving slightly with his breath. His eyes flicked up to Ethan, and for the first time in days they looked clear. Ethan crouched beside him, rubbing his head gently. "We made it, buddy." Ranger exhaled through his nose, resting his head against Ethan's knee. That simple gesture sent a lump to Ethan's throat. This dog had been by his side through war, through loss, through sleepless nights and unbearable memories. And now Ethan had finally been able to repay him by saving him in return. Amy had sent home a small care package, medications, bandages, instructions, but Ethan barely needed the notes. He had spent years tending to Ranger's wounds. This was no different. For a while, Ethan just sat there with him, letting the quiet settle. The weight of the past week still clung to him, but for the first time, it wasn't suffocating. It was simply there, lingering but no longer crushing him. Ranger shifted slightly and gave a half-hearted attempt to lift his head. Ethan chuckled. "Take it easy, tough guy. You're not on duty anymore." Ranger's ears twitched, as if to say, "Since when?" Ethan leaned back against the couch, stretching his legs out beside Ranger's bed. "You know," he mused, staring at the ceiling, "I've been thinking about something." Ranger's eyes flicked up at him. "The day you took that bullet?" Ethan swallowed. "I should have known. I should have checked, but you just kept going like nothing ever happened." Ranger let out a low, slow sigh, the kind of sound that only came from deep understanding. Ethan huffed. "Guess that's just who we are, huh? Keep pushing forward no matter what." Silence stretched between them. It was comfortable, familiar. Then, slowly, Ranger stretched his front legs out, the smallest hint of a tail wag flicking against the soft bed beneath him. That was all Ethan needed. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Ranger's. "We're good, buddy. We're home." Ranger's tail wagged again. No words were needed, no explanations, because in the end, that was all that mattered. Home, together, always.